When I first came across it, I was on the verge of panic. Heavy footsteps in the basement, a strange smell, and this quiet but palpable trembling. Every time I thought that I would not find him anymore, he appeared again. I knew this would be my last night if I didn't escape. My work in a safe neighborhood told me that nothing happens here. But as I began to investigate, one thing became clear. Brutal murders had become a part of my life. The secrets of the small town seem attractive on the surface, but underneath lies hell. Later, I realized that all the tracks led to an old warehouse that had not been used for a long time. I noticed traces of blood and smells that smelled creepy. My instincts screamed of danger, but curiosity outweighed fear. Once, when I came across an expanded map with points where people disappeared, I realized that this is not just a game. It was serious, and every mark on the map was clearly marked. In the warehouse, I found old photos scattered on the floor of the victims. Their gazes were full of horror, and their faces were ordinary people who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. My first meeting with him was scarier than any of my worst nightmares. He was like I had not imagined, calm, self-confident, but with darkness in his eyes. I could feel my heart pounding, and every muscle in my body tried to escape. Every attempt to report him to the police ended in nothing. No one believed me, and I began to doubt my sanity. Maybe I just lost my mind, and it was just a figment of my imagination. Over time, I learned that he knew how to play smart. Every time I tried to rest, I heard his voices in my head, and there was no escape from them. I started keeping a journal to keep from going crazy. With each page, I felt my fears grow stronger and reality blur. My investigation led me to a new trail. Several places where people who disappeared without a trace used to live. All these places turned out to be equally creepy and dangerous. One day, when I was trying to find new evidence, I received a message from an anonymous person. The text was simple: "I'm always there. You can't run away." My attempts to discover where these messages are coming from have been unsuccessful. He always knew what I was doing and where I was going. I felt completely defenseless. Every day it became clearer that this is not just a maniac. It was an elaborate game in which I was only one part. His goal was to understand how far I was willing to go to reveal the truth. Night visits to my apartment began to become regular. I thought I could hear his breathing when I slept. I felt trapped in my own home. Every time I thought I could find a way to stop him, he always found new ways to make me doubt myself. I started to lose my identity, and he played with my mind. I learned that his victims were not random. They were chosen for a reason. Their lives and stories were pieces of a larger puzzle he was trying to solve. My meeting with him became even more terrifying when I saw that he had a list of new victims. I was on this list, and I understood that every next step could be my last. It was impossible to get out of this hell, and I began to notice that he was trying his best to impress me emotionally, not physically. It was hard for me to determine where my reality ended and his manipulation began. Every time I thought I could prevent his next move, he always found a way to confuse me. I began to ask myself if I could even hope for salvation. He left no stone unturned when it came to breaking my will. Every night I woke up thinking that today might be my last day. With each new day, it became clearer to me that this is not just a struggle for survival. It was a battle for my soul, and I knew that if I couldn't handle it, I would lose not only my life, but my identity. Every time I found a new trail or new evidence, he always knew how to distort it, or even destroy it. My struggle seemed hopeless, but I could not allow myself to stop. His goal was simpler than I thought. He just enjoyed my fear and watched me fight for my life. It was his way of proving that he was always in control. I found out that he's planning his last game. This game wasn't just about killing. It was about how far I was willing to go to survive. The more I learned about him, the more I realized that his behavior was part of a bigger picture. He didn't just kill. He conducted experiments that questioned the very essence of human nature. My attempt to find help from friends and relatives ended in failure. He moved so fast that I couldn't prevent his next move, and it made me feel completely isolated. I realized that I needed to act quickly to unravel his plans. Each new day brought new horrors, and I began to notice that he was trying to make me a part of his terrible fantasies. My nights turned into sleepless nightmares where I tried to find my way out of the maze of fear he created around me. I knew that if I didn't find a way to escape, I would lose myself. With each new act, his plan became more and more obvious. I realized that he was not just a serial killer. He was a psychological manipulator who played with my deepest fears. He knew my darkest secrets and used them against me. Every new piece of evidence I found was part of a grand plan that he had thought out down to the smallest detail. My struggle with him became even more difficult when I realized that he knows my every move, and his plans are always several steps ahead. I could feel my patience wearing thin and fear becoming a daily reality. I started getting strange calls that made me doubt reality even more. The answers I received were cryptic and reminded me that I was always under surveillance. Every attempt to escape was unsuccessful. I could feel my environment becoming more and more hostile, and my chances of salvation were melting away along with my self-belief. I knew that his goal was not just to intimidate me. He wanted to break me psychologically, make me doubt my mental balance, and make me feel hopeless. In every new place I went, I found new traces of his presence. He always left something to remind me that I would never be safe. I learned that his activities were not just random. All his actions and manipulations were part of a complex game where he tried to test my limits and determine how far I was willing to go to survive. I began to understand that he had a plan, and that plan was much bigger than I could have imagined. He created situations that forced me to be on the verge of a nervous breakdown. I decided to collect all the pieces of information I could find and try to build a model of his psychology. It was the only thing left, to figure out his motivation and break his game. My attempts to find support from other people failed again. No one could understand why I was so alarmed, and I was left alone with my fear. Every time I thought I had found the key to the solution, he always found a way to destroy my attempts. I began to feel trapped, and each new day brought new challenges. His plans were intricate, and I understood that he was watching my every move. My attempts to decipher his motives became more and more difficult. My situation became worse and worse, and I began to doubt whether there was even a chance of salvation. I felt my strength melting away, and fear became an integral part of my life. I decided to try a new approach. Maybe if I can check his personal history and find his weak points, I can find a way to stop him. My attempts to find out more about his past have been unsuccessful. He left very few tracks, and I felt that every step I took only brought me closer to danger. My nights became a real nightmare, and I began to feel that my life was on the edge. I learned that he had his own idea of justice, and it was a brutal game of survival. Over time, I began to notice that he shows interest in my loved ones. This made me even more anxious, and I knew I had to find a way to protect them from his attack. My attempt to find new ways of salvation turned out to be more difficult than I imagined. He always knew what I was doing, and his manipulations became more and more complex and psychologically loaded. I learned that he uses people as part of his game. He manipulates them to achieve his goals and make me feel even more scared. My efforts to find proof of his crimes were futile. He always knew how to destroy the tracks and leave me in a state of constant fear and uncertainty. I began to suspect that he would try to kill me through a public place. I tried to avoid all possible traps, but he was always one step ahead. My attempts to get help from law enforcement were fruitless. I felt trapped and knew I had to act on my own to find a way to stop him. I began to notice that he was increasingly concentrating on psychological pressure. Each new act was aimed at making me feel hopeless. Over time, I learned that he was able to manipulate situations in such a way as to create the appearance of control. It was part of his plan to make me feel completely defenseless. I began to see signs that his mania was taking the form of a big game. His every move was calculated, and he played with my emotions to throw me off balance. My attempt to decipher his plans always ended in failure. I felt that every step brought me closer to the end, and he already had my destruction planned. With each new act, he showed how well he understood human psychology. He used my fears and weaknesses to increase his dominance. My conversations with him became more and more violent. He played with me like a puppet, and I began to lose the ability to distinguish reality from his manipulations. I decided to try to understand his motivation through an analysis of his past. Perhaps understanding the roots of his evil will help me find a way to stop him. My search for evidence and information about him was difficult and dangerous. He was always one step ahead, and my every attempt to find new tracks ended in danger. I began to notice that he was using people's fears against themselves. It was part of his game to create situations that made people feel even more helpless. I learned that he was manipulating information to confuse me. Each new piece of evidence seemed like part of his... Maybe understanding his mind games will help me find a way to win. My efforts to identify his weak points were fruitless. He had new ways to manipulate and make me feel afraid. I learned that he has his own idea of justice, which is not subject to discussion. His plans and actions were based on his personal beliefs, which I could not understand. Each new day brought new challenges. He always found ways to keep me on edge, and my patience was at its limit. I found out that his plans were getting bigger and bigger, and he was trying to manipulate not only me, but also the people who were close to me. I began to notice that he was using psychological games to instill fear in everyone around me. This was part of his plan to expand the circle of his power. My attempts to find new ways out of the situation ended in failure. He was always ahead and knew how to keep his game at the highest level. I decided to try to change my strategy and focus on what I could control. It was the only thing left to maintain control over one's own actions and decisions. My struggle with him turned into a real psychological war. I felt that every new day was becoming more difficult and dangerous. I learned that he has his own motivation and plan that is part of the bigger game. His actions had nothing to do with logic, and that was part of his manipulation. My attempts to find support from the people around me ended in failure. I was left alone with my fear and uncertainty. I decided to turn to experts in the field of psychology to learn more about his methods of manipulation. It was the only thing left, to try to unravel his psychological games. My efforts to discover his plans and motives were unsuccessful. He always found ways to deceive and manipulate me. I began to notice that his manipulations were becoming more and more complex. He used every possible method to maintain his control over the situation. My struggle with him became even more intense when I realized that he had big plans beyond what I could imagine. I learned that he uses different tactics to improve his game. These were complex psychological games that I had to unravel in order to find a way to stop him. My attempts to find new ways of salvation were fruitless. He always had new methods of manipulation that made my struggle even more difficult. I decided to focus on understanding his personal motivation. Maybe this will help me find the weak spots in his plans and find a way to win. My efforts to unravel his plans became even more difficult when I realized that he had his own version of justice. It was part of his game, and I had to find a way around his rules. I learned that he has his own philosophy that guides his actions. His plans were part of a larger game in which he tried to manipulate everyone around him. My struggle became even more intense when I realized that he was using his plans as a tool for control. I had to find a way to figure out his motives and stop him. I began to notice that his plans were becoming more and more convoluted. Each new step was part of a big game in which he tried to keep me in suspense. My attempts to find new ways out of the situation ended in failure. He was always one step ahead, and his manipulations became more and more sophisticated. I decided to contact a psychologist to learn more about his methods of manipulation. It was the only thing left, to try to understand him and find a way to stop him. My attempts to figure out his plans became even more difficult when I realized that he was using every possible method to keep me in suspense and fear. I learned that his plans became even more extensive, and he tried to manipulate not only me, but also everyone around me. My struggle became even more intense when I realized that he had new plans and goals. Each new day brought new challenges and dangers. I began to understand that his manipulations became even more complex. He used all possible methods to keep me in suspense and fear. My efforts to unravel his plans became even more difficult when I realized that he was using psychological games to achieve his goals. I decided to try to find new ways to unravel his motives. Maybe this will help me find the weak spots in his plans and stop him. My struggle became even more intense when I realized that he was using every possible method of manipulation. Each new day brought new challenges and dangers. I learned that his plans were becoming more and more complicated. He used all possible methods to keep me in suspense and fear. My attempts to find new ways of salvation ended in failure. He always had new methods of manipulation that made my struggle even more difficult. I decided to focus on understanding his motives and plans. It was the only thing left, to find a way to solve it and stop it. My struggle became even more intense when I realized that he had big plans beyond what I could imagine. I learned that his methods of manipulation are becoming even more sophisticated. He used every possible means to maintain his control over the situation. My struggle with him turned into a real psychological war. I felt that every new day was becoming more difficult and dangerous. I decided to try to find new ways to unravel his motives. It was the only thing left, to find a way to unravel his plan and stop him. My fight with him was finally coming to an end. I managed to figure out his plans and find a way to stop his manipulations. It was the end of a great psychological war that had lasted so long. After I was finally able to stop his manipulations, I felt that this was not the end. I was haunted by questions about whether the real end had come or if this was just the beginning of his plans. I began to pay attention to details that previously seemed insignificant. Perhaps it was these little things that could give me an idea of what still remained unknown. My fears were confirmed when I discovered that some of his plans were not fully implemented. He left me clues that indicated the fight was not over. I decided that I could not rely on chance. It was necessary to delve deeper and find out what other plans he might have left. My mind was working at the limit of what was possible. I began to receive new alarm signals. These were small but alarming signs that something might be wrong. His shadow was still there even when I tried to ignore it. It turned out that his plans included not only me, but other people as well. I began to understand that he had a wider purpose than I could imagine. I gathered all the evidence I could find and turned to the experts. This helped me expand my understanding of his tactics and perhaps reveal aspects that have not yet been elucidated. I learned that his plans were not only psychological manipulations, but also real threats to other people's lives. My struggle became more and more urgent. During the investigation, I came across documents confirming his numerous crimes. It was proof that his influence on people was much greater than I could have imagined. I started to feel the pressure when I realized that he might attack again. I could not afford to be irresponsible, so I began careful planning. My tactic was to use all the data gathered to formulate a final counter-strategy. This required maximum concentration and calm from me. I felt that my mind could no longer withstand the pressure. Anxiety and fear became constant companions, and I had to find ways to cope with them. My plan was to find and destroy all possible sources of his influence. I began to carefully follow his every step. I again turned to criminology experts for further advice. It helped me better understand how to manipulate the situation. My efforts were worth it when I finally found a new trail. It was a discovery that could lead me to new evidence of his criminal activities. I discovered that he used numerous fronts to expand his network. This made my struggle more difficult and required extra effort. My struggle became even more complicated when I realized that he had big plans that required careful analysis and coordination. I began to notice that his methods had become even more aggressive. He tried to destroy my resources and undermine my efforts. My attempts to find new countermeasures proved difficult. He always found ways to control the situation and leave me in limbo. I decided to take a big step and contact the law enforcement authorities with all the available evidence. It was risky, but maybe it would help stop him. My efforts paid off when the law enforcement officers began an investigation. It was a step forward, but I knew the fight was not over yet. I learned that he has hidden reserves that may help him avoid justice. This became a new source of anxiety for me. My actions became more cautious when I realized that he could have countless other plans. Each new day became another test. I began to feel that I needed to find new allies to fight him. Maybe this will help me find new ways to counter it. My efforts to find allies proved successful. I found several people who could help me fight him. I learned that his plans have become even more complex and large-scale. He used all possible methods to keep the situation under control. My struggle became even more intense when I realized that he was using new tactics to avoid detention. It was a difficult task that required a lot of concentration. I decided that I needed to use all the available resources to achieve the goal. It required a lot of effort and resources. My new allies became an integral part of my strategy. With their help, I was able to get new information and find new countermeasures. I learned that he continues his crimes using new methods. This increased my anxiety and forced me to be even more careful. My fight against him became even more difficult when I realized that he was using new manipulation techniques to extend his control. I decided to use all available resources to stop him. This required considerable effort and constant monitoring of his actions. I began to notice that his plans were becoming even more convoluted and complicated. This made my struggle even more difficult and dangerous. My efforts to unravel his motives and plans became even more intense. I felt that every new day brought new challenges and dangers. I decided to investigate further to find out more about his plans and find ways to stop his criminal activities. My new investigative efforts gave me new insights into his plans. This allowed me to find new ways of countering. I began to notice that his actions were becoming even more aggressive. This forced me to be even more attentive and careful in my actions. My struggle became even more intense when I realized that he was using new tactics to destroy my efforts. I decided to take advantage of new opportunities to achieve my goal. This required considerable effort and constant monitoring of the situation. I learned that he has new plans that could endanger even more people. This increased my anxiety and made me act faster. My struggle with him became even more intense when I realized that his plans were becoming even more complex and large-scale. I decided to use all available resources to resolve the situation. This required considerable effort and careful planning. My new investigative efforts allowed me to find new countermeasures. I began to notice that the situation was becoming even more complicated. I decided to bring in additional experts for the investigation. It helped me better understand his tactics and find new ways to fight. My efforts to unravel his plans became even more intense. I felt that every new day brought new challenges and dangers. I learned that his plans are becoming even more aggressive. This forced me to be even more attentive and careful in my actions. My struggle with him turned into a real war. I concentrated all my forces on achieving the goal and stopping his criminal activities. I decided to take advantage of new opportunities to solve the situation. This required considerable effort and constant monitoring of his actions. My fight with him was coming to an end. I felt that I was already close to achieving my goal and stopping his criminal activities. The end was near when I was able to finally unravel all his plans and stop his criminal activities. My struggle is over, but the memory of these events will remain forever. After I managed to stop his criminal activities, I thought I could find peace. But after experiencing all this, I realized that fear will stay with me forever. I continued to follow the news, trying to find out if there would be any new reports about his activities. I still felt that his influence could last. It turned out that his crimes were not the only ones. I have found evidence that he may have accomplices or followers who continue his cause. I decided to continue the investigation, even if it meant new dangers and stress. I couldn't afford to leave anything to chance. My investigation led me to new individuals who may have information about his network. I tried to establish contacts with those who could be useful. I felt that my life became even more dangerous when I learned about new threats that could be associated with his accomplices. My fight against new threats became even more intense. I was constantly looking for new ways of protection and continued to be on the alert. I found information that indicated that his accomplices may have been part of a larger organization that had plans for the future. My attempts to discover the details of this organization turned out to be difficult and dangerous. I met with new difficulties and challenges. I began to receive new alarm signals when I realized that my actions could be under the control of this organization. I had to find a way to remain unnoticed. I decided to use new technologies to gather information to avoid direct contact with danger. This allowed me to get new data without risk. My efforts were successful when I found new connections in the organization. I learned that their plans were even bigger than I could have imagined. I decided to use this information to create a new counter-strategy. It required a lot of effort and resources from me. I continued to follow the organization's activities, trying to learn more about their plans and find a way to stop them. My struggle became even more difficult when I learned that the organization was using new methods to avoid detection. I decided to use the help of new allies to investigate. It helped me get new data and find new ways to fight. My new allies became an important part of my strategy. With their help, I was able to get new information and expand the investigation. I discovered that the organization has a multi-layered structure that complicates my investigative efforts. I needed to find ways to penetrate this structure. My fight against the organization became even more intense when I learned about their new plans and the threats they posed. I decided to use all available resources to achieve the goal. This required me to constantly monitor and carefully plan. My investigative efforts gave me new insights into the organization and its plans. I was able to find new countermeasures. I learned that the organization has new resources and support, which makes my struggle more difficult. I needed to find new strategies to overcome these challenges. I decided to turn to the experts for additional advice and information. It helped me better understand new threats and find new solutions. My struggle with the organization became even more intense when I realized that their plans were global in scope. It required even more effort from me. I began to receive new alarm signals about possible threats. This forced me to be even more attentive and careful in my actions. My new investigative efforts allowed me to uncover new details about the organization. I learned about their plans and methods of their implementation. I decided to take advantage of new opportunities to achieve my goal. This required considerable effort and constant monitoring of the situation from me. My investigative efforts led to new discoveries. I found new connections that helped me better understand the plans of the organization. My struggle became even more intense when I learned about new threats that could threaten me and other people. I decided to turn to new allies for help. It helped me find new ways to deal with organization. My new allies became an important part of my strategy. With their help, I was able to get new information and expand the investigation. I learned that the organization has new resources that allow them to avoid detection and continue their activities. This made my efforts to fight difficult. My fight against the organization became even more complicated when I realized that their plans could endanger even more people. I decided to use all available resources to achieve the goal. This required me to constantly monitor and carefully plan. My investigative efforts allowed me to find new opportunities to counter the organization. I was able to get new data and find new ways to fight. I began to notice new warning signs that indicated that the organization might be using new tactics. This made me pay even more attention. My investigative efforts became even more intense. I learned about new aspects of the organization's activities and their plans for the future. I decided to take advantage of new opportunities to achieve my goal. This required me to constantly monitor and carefully plan. My struggle with the organization became even more confusing and complicated as I learned about new plans and the threats they posed. I continued to follow the activities of the organization, trying to learn more about their plans and find ways to counter them. My investigative efforts allowed me to find new connections and details that helped me better understand the activities of the organization. I decided to take advantage of new opportunities to achieve my goal. This required considerable effort and constant monitoring of the situation from me. My struggle with the organization became even more intense when I learned about new threats that could threaten me and other people. I decided to turn to new allies for help. It helped me find new ways to deal with organization. My new allies became an important part of my strategy. With their help, I was able to get new information and expand the investigation. I learned that the organization has new resources and methods that complicate my efforts to fight. I needed to find new strategies to overcome these challenges. My fight against the organization became even more intense when I realized that their plans could endanger even more people. I decided to use all available resources to achieve the goal. This required me to constantly monitor and carefully plan. My investigative efforts gave me new insights into the organization and its plans. I was able to find new countermeasures. The end of my struggle came when I was finally able to unravel all the plans of the organization and stop their activities. My struggle is over, but the fear and worry will stay with me forever. This expanded version of the story highlights the complexity and tension of the fight against a serial killer and his organization, showing all the difficulties and strategies necessary to achieve the goal.